The first thing Mara Voss noticed about the town of Decker's Hollow was that the birds had stopped. Not gradually. Not in that slow, dawning way that silence usually arrived. One moment the desert was full of the dry, rattling song of Cacasti wrens, and the next it was nothing. Like someone had thrown a switch. She was standing in the bed of the prison transport, her wrists zip-tied to the roll bar when she felt it. That hollowness pressing in from all sides, the kind that made the air taste like copper. "You feel that," she said. Nobody answered. The man they called Priest was watching the road through the wire mesh divider, his tattooed forearms resting on his knees, patient as stone. Across from her, Dex Carrillo was picking at a scab on his knuckle with the focused intensity of a man performing surgery. Behind him, Sergeant Yolanda Ferris, the senior guard, the one who hadn't stopped sweating since they left the state facility 4 hours ago, was watching the window with her hand resting on her holster, which was empty now. They'd taken that from her back at the overpass. 3 death row inmates and 2 guards, rolling through the Sonoran in a stolen transport. The plan, such as it was, belonged to Dex. He'd told them about the town in the desert with the abandoned copper mine. The kind of place nobody looked. Dex had relatives everywhere. He always knew a place. That was his gift, geography. He could look at a map once and remember it forever. Every back road, every dry creek, every forgotten junction. His other gift was a complete absence of self-preservation instinct, which was why he was on death row in the first place. "Town's close," Dex said, checking his stolen watch. "Mile. Maybe 2. "You said that 20 minutes ago," said the other guard, Hooper Young, his lips still split from where Priest had hit him during the takeover. He was trying to sound hard. He wasn't doing great. "Maps are estimates," Dex said pleasantly. Mara looked out at the desert. The saguaro stood enormous and motionless in the late afternoon light, throwing long purple shadows east. Beautiful and indifferent, the way deserts always were. She'd grown up 200 miles north of here, where the ground was red instead of tan. And she'd spent 20 years as a trauma surgeon, before the accident, before the trial, before the 8x10 cell that had been her world for the last 3 years. She knew what copper tasted like. She knew what the stud absence of ambient sound meant in a body. It meant something systemic had failed, something the body had been quietly compensating for, until it couldn't anymore. She thought about that. The driver, a corrections officer named Polk, the only one still armed, seated behind bulletproof glass, slowed the transport as the town appeared on the horizon. Just rooftops at first, flat and pale against the scrub, then a water tower, then the main drag of a town that didn't look like anyone had been through it recently. "Stop here," Dex said. "I'm not stopping," Polk said through the intercom. But he was already slowing. Something in the quality of the place had gotten into him too. They rolled to a stop at the edge of town. A hardware store. A diner with the open sign still hanging in the window, unlit. A gas station with one of the pumps knocked sideways, as though something heavy had brushed against it. No cars. No movement. The kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful. The kind that was the aftermath of something. "This is your safe house," Ferris said. Her voice was dry. "Give it a minute," Dex said, though he was looking at his hands now, instead of the town. Priest stood up from his bench in a single fluoshonum and pressed his face to the mesh, studying the main street with those pale, unreadable eyes. He had an economy of movement that Mara had noticed on day 1. No gesture wasted, nothing performed. Before death row, before the bodies they said he'd buried in 3 states, he'd been special forces. She'd read enough of his file to know that much. "Someone was running," he said quietly. "What?" he pointed. Mara followed his finger to the sidewalk in front of the diner. A woman's shoe lay on its side near the curb, just one. The pavement around it was dark in a way that might have been an old oil stain. Might have been. "Let me out," Priest said. "Nobody's going anywhere," Polk said through the glass. "Then drive in slow and tell me when your hands stop shaking." Long pause. Then the transport rolled forward. They found the soldier 3 blocks in, crouched behind an overturned pickup truck, in the parking lot of what had been a grocery store. He had a rifle in his hands and a look on his face that Mara had seen before, in the ER, on the faces of people who'd been in car accidents and hadn't had time to process it yet. That wide, operating look, everything narrowed to stimulus and response, the thinking brain suspended. He was also bleeding badly from a wound below his right shoulder, that he'd packed with what appeared to be a chunk of his own shirt. He had the rifle upset on Polk's windshield before the transport had fully stopped. "Federal officer," Polk said over the intercom, hands visible on the wheel. This is a corrections transport, we have." "How many in the vehicle?" the soldier said. Not a question. His voice was absolutely flat. 2 officers and 3 transfer detainees. Are any of them armed? I am. The detainees are not. The soldier held his position for 3 full seconds, scanning the vehicle, scanning the street behind it, scanning the vehicle again. Then he lowered the rifle a fraction. Get out slowly, leave the engine running. If any detainee tries to run, I will shoot them. You'll shoot an unarmed. The perimeter of this town is approximately 4 blocks in any direction, the soldier said. If you run, you will be dead before you reach it. That is not a threat. That is current information. Get out of the vehicle. Was Captain John Marsh, and he was the last member of a 12-man special operations team that had been dispatched to investigate an object that had come down in the copper mine 2 miles east of town 3 days ago. He told them this in the grocery store, in the canned goods aisle, seated on an overturned milk crate with his back to a wall and the rifle across his knees. He told it the way someone reported a situation: sequence, facts, estimated casualties, without color or editorial. But his jaw was doing something tight and controlled, and Mara, who had spent 2 decades reading bodies, could see the effort it was taking. What were they? Dex said. The things. Bipedal. Approximately 2 meters tall when fully upright. They don't prefer fully upright. Marsh paused. They hunt in the tunnels. The mine connects to about 6 miles of old excavation shafts. They know the layout better than we did, better than any of us did. How many? Said Ed. Unknown. We recovered the ship, analyzed what we could before. Marsh stopped. Started again. The ship was a transport, not military. Our tech team said the configuration was consistent with containment, restraint systems, individual cells. We think it was a prisoner vessel. Silence in the canned goods aisle. You're telling me, Ferris said slowly, that the aliens hunting this town are alien convicts? Marsh looked at her. That's what the evidence indicated, yes. Dex made a sound that in other circumstances might have been a laugh. How's that funny? Hooper said. It's not. Dex looked at the floor. It's not funny at all. Mara was already moving to Marsh, crouching in front of him with her hands raised to show empty palms. I'm a surgeon. Let me look at that shoulder. He watched her for a moment. Then he nodded. The wound was bad but not fatal if treated. She worked with what she found. A first aid kit from behind the store counter, surgical tape, strips of clean plastic sheeting. Her hands did the work while her mind turned over what Marsh had said. A prison transport. Occupants loose in the tunnels. She thought about Dex and his geography, his maps memorized in a glance. She thought about Priest and his rifle and his horrible patience. She thought about what 8 years in a military prison would do to a creature that was already built to hunt. They figured out the tunnels fast, she said as she worked. How fast? First contact was 18 hours after we arrived, Marsh said. We had established a perimeter. They came up through the mine shafts, through gaps in the floor inside buildings. They had already scouted the exits before we knew they were moving. They communicated, Priest said. It wasn't a question. They coordinated, yes. Then they're not animals. No, Marsh agreed. They're not. Ferris had her radio out and was trying frequencies, getting static on all of them. She reported this with the professional composure of someone who had decided that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford and had simply set it aside. Government knows we're here, Marsh said. There's a strike package on a 40-minute delay from Holloman, Air Force. They're going to level the town. Another silence, this one with a different quality. When? Priest said. Approximately 3 hours from now. Maybe less. The delay was to allow extraction of my team. He said the last part without inflection. The timeline hasn't been updated. So as far as they know, Mara said, you're all dead, as far as they know. Hooper put his hands over his face. Dex looked at the ceiling. Ferris set the radio down with careful precision and folded her hands in her lap. Right, she said. Okay. What do we need? What they needed was a way to signal the Air Force without the radios that didn't work. What they had was a hardware store, an abandoned mining office with a generator, 3 convicted criminals, 2 corrections officers with 1 firearm between them, and a special operations captain who was running on adrenaline and blood loss. Marsh knew the layout of the mine's electrical infrastructure. He'd spent the first day surveying it. The original copper operation had run a series of ventilation shafts that fed down into the main excavation and could be accessed from the mining office half a mile up the main road. If they could get the emergency generator running and push current through the old ventilation grid, they could create an electromagnetic signature that the Air Force strike package's targeting systems would read as a non-hostile emitter. A specifically coded signal that Marsh's team had been assigned as identification. In theory, Dex repeated. The alternative is to do nothing and wait for the bombing run. Marsh said. I've been waiting for my execution for 3 years, Dex said. I'm tired of waiting. He stood up and brushed off his knees. Show me the generator. They moved in 2 groups. Marsh, Dex, and Priest to the mining office. Mara, Ferris, and Hooper to hold the grocery store and provide what armed cover they could, which was 1 handgun and 3 people who were very motivated to not get eaten. Mara spent the first 20 minutes of the wait inventorying the store's first aid supplies and building a better trauma kit. Her hands needed to be doing something, or her mind started running calculations she didn't want to run. Odds and distances, and the acoustics of something moving through ductwork. She heard it before the others did, a sound beneath the floor. Not random, rhythmic, testing. They're in the service tunnels, she said. Ferris had the gun up and pointed at the floor, which was, Mara thought, about as useful as pointing a gun at a thunderstorm. There's a loading dock in the back, Hooper said. He'd been useful, actually. Quick thinking, good eyes. Fear had clarified him. It's raised. Concrete pad, nothing directly below. They moved to the loading dock. The creatures came up through the floor of the main sales area 40 seconds later. Mara heard it from the dock, the crack of tile, the sound of something pulling itself up into air and light. Then a sound she had no word for, something between a chord and a frequency, low enough to feel in the back of the teeth. They were communicating. Right now, on the other side of that wall, they were talking to each other. Ferris fired 3 shots through the wall in a tight grouping at approximately chest height. The sound on the other side shifted. Movement, fast and multiple, and then the particular silence of something that has decided to circle rather than charge. They're smart enough to not come at the sound of the gun, Hooper said. Yes, Mara said. I know. She was looking at the loading dock's ancient equipment. A hydraulic lift, a pallet jack, several drums of what the faded stenciling identified as machine lubricant. She was thinking about pressure and ignition points, and the medical fact that even very large bodies had circulatory systems, had things inside them that were under pressure, and that pressure, if suddenly relieved, caused rapid incapacitation regardless of species. She was also thinking about the ventilation duct running along the ceiling of the loading dock, which connected, according to the old facility map she'd found tacked to the break room wall, to the main building's HVAC, which pulled from outside. From outside, Hooper, she said, how good are you at holding your breath? Back in the mining office, Priest was looking at a generator that hadn't run in 11 years and deciding that it was going to run tonight. He had no engineering background. What he had was a memory that worked like a filing system, and the experience of having repaired field equipment under conditions that made this seem gentle. Dex was beside him with a flashlight and a box of tools, handing things over when asked, not talking. He had the quality of someone who understood that this was not a moment for conversation. Marsh was on the floor with his back against the wall, conserving what he had left, watching the door. Tell me about your team, Dex said quietly to Marsh. Marsh looked at him. Not for any reason, Dex said. Just, it's quiet, long pause. Then Marsh said, 12 of us, mixed backgrounds. 2 had kids. Kowalski had twin girls. He used to show people pictures, whether they asked or not. Another pause. I always pretended it was annoying. Dex nodded slowly. The youngest was 23, Marsh said. First deployment out of training. Good instincts, fast. He stopped. They were all fast. These things are faster. Are they smarter? Marsh thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about everything, with the same precise, unemotional attention. In some ways, they understand geometry better than we do. They think in 3 dimensions habitually. Underground, they're extraordinary. He looked at his hands. But they only understand one kind of threat. The kind that comes at them. They've never encountered something that doesn't try to win by being stronger or faster. Priest set down a wrench and looked over. What does that mean? I don't know yet, Marsh said. I've been thinking about it for 3 days. The generator turned over at 40 minutes past the hour, which was, by Priest's internal clock, cutting it close. It coughed, caught, and settled into an uneven growl that filled the old mining office with a smell of hot metal and decades-old fuel. The lights overhead, a single fluorescent tube, flickered and then held. Dex laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him. He clapped his hands once and then looked embarrassed about it. Okay, Priest said. He was already moving to the control board. The signal would take 12 minutes to propagate through the old ventilation grid and reach the surface emitters. That was Marsh's estimate. 12 minutes during which they needed the generator to keep running and the mining office to remain secure. Because if the creatures detected the electromagnetic output, and Marsh believed they would, believed their sensory range included frequencies humans couldn't perceive. They would try to stop it. They came up through the mineshaft access panel in the floor of the office at minute 4. Marsh shot the first one through the panel before it fully emerged. The second came through the adjacent ventilation grate in the wall, a gap none of them had thought to cover, because it was 18 inches across, and they hadn't believed anything could compress itself that small. It could. It moved like water filling a space, and it was on decks before Priest could reacquire the target. Priest didn't fire, couldn't fire, not at that range, not without hitting decks. He dropped the rifle and went in with his hands. What he did then Marsh would not describe later, not even when asked directly. He would only say that Priest was efficient, and that whatever had been done to him before he'd become the thing he was, it had given him an understanding of where bodies broke. Human bodies and, it turned out, bodies that weren't human. The creature stopped moving at minute 7. Marsh held the transmit button down for the remaining 5 minutes and did not let go. At the grocery store, Mara had routed machine lubricant through the loading dock's hydraulic lines and into the HVAC intake, which had pumped an aerosol mixture into the main sales floor. She had no way to know if the creature's biology was vulnerable to petroleum distillates. She'd reasoned that any aerobic organism with a circulatory system and mucous membranes was likely to find a fine hydrocarbon mist in an enclosed space suboptimal. She'd been right, mostly. 2 of the creatures had come out through the loading dock door. Not charging, but retreating, which told her something important about their decision-making under stress. And Ferris had shot one through the throat before it reoriented. The other had gone over the railing and into the scrub and not come back. The third had not come out at all. Mara chose not to think about the third one yet. When Hooper's radio, the one they hadn't tried, the one he'd been carrying, in his inside jacket pocket and had somehow forgotten about in the chaos of the prison break, crackled to life with an Air Force frequency. At minute 53, Mara was sitting on the loading dock railing, her hands wrapped around a bottle of water she'd found in the break room refrigerator, watching the sun go down over the Sonoran. The desert had gone gold and copper and red. The saguaros cast their long shadows. Somewhere out in the scrub, something was moving. Probably just a rabbit, probably, almost certainly. And the sky above was the deep blue that preceded the real dark. And it was very beautiful, in the way that deserts were always beautiful and always indifferent. The radio said, "Unknown transmitter, identify yourself. This is Air Force Strike Command. Identify or we begin approach." Ferris grabbed the radio and said, "Strike Command, this is Corrections Officer Ferris, Facility 7 Transfer Unit. We have Captain John Marsh of Special Operations Command and 5 civilian survivors at the Deckers Hollow mining office. I say again, Captain Marsh is alive. Strike package must be aborted. Please confirm." Static then. "Corrections Officer Ferris, can you verify?" Marsh took the radio from her. He spoke 7 words in a code that Mara didn't know, numbers and designations in a sequence that took less than 4 seconds. Then he handed the radio back. Longer static. Then, "Package is aborted. Package is aborted. Sit tight, we have assets en route." Ferris set the radio down. She sat down on the concrete of the loading dock. She put her face in her hands and her shoulders moved once, and then she was still. Hooper was crying. He wasn't doing anything about it, just standing there with tears on his face in the last of the desert light. Mara looked at the sky. 2 miles east, the mine shaft access that Marsh had mapped sat quiet in the dark. And somewhere down in those tunnels, in those 6 miles of old excavation that a copper company had dug out of the earth 100 years ago, or for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this, the remaining creatures were moving in the way that intelligent things moved when they were recalculating. When the plan they'd relied on for however long, whatever span of time and space had carried them from their world to this one, had just failed to produce the expected outcome. Mara thought about what Marsh had said. They only understand one kind of threat, the kind that comes at them. They had never encountered something that said, "We are not going to fight you by your rules. We are going to change the air. We are going to remember which pocket the radio was in. We are going to fix a generator that hasn't run in 11 years because we are tired and scared, and we would really rather not die today." They had never encountered people who had already lost everything and had therefore figured out exactly how little they had to lose. She heard Priest and Dex before she saw them, the crunch of gravel, 2 sets of footsteps crossing the parking lot from the direction of the mining office. They came around the corner and stopped when they saw the others. Dex was holding his left arm close to his body, and there was blood on his sleeve. But he was walking fine and his eyes were clear. Priest had the rifle across his back and his hands loose at his sides, and the expression of someone returning from a long errand. "Generator still running," Priest said. "Signal went through," Marsh said from inside the doorway. He'd made it that far under his own power. "Strike package is aborted. Extraction in approximately 90 minutes. Priest looked at him for a long moment. "Good," Priest said. They stood in the parking lot in the gathering dark. 6 people who had no business being alive. Mara finished her water. Dex sat down on the hood of a car and looked at the stars coming out overhead. The first ones appearing now in the deep blue east, and she watched him watching them. That bright, fixed attention, like someone who had been told he was going to die, and had spent 3 years thinking about everything he'd never see again. And now here was the night sky, here were the stars, and he was looking at them like he was memorizing them all over again. "They came from out there," he said quietly, "not a question, just placing a fact in the air." "Yes," Mara said. Dex nodded slowly. "Long way to go," he said, "to end up in a hole in the ground in Arizona." Ferris made a sound that was almost a laugh. The helicopters came in from the west an hour, and 20 minutes later, their lights strobing against the dark desert sky. And Mara stood in the parking lot and watched them come down, and she thought, this is the part where it's supposed to be over. But she was a surgeon. She knew that the hard part was never the crisis. The crisis had its own momentum, its own clear logic. The hard part was always what came after. When the adrenaline bled off and you had to look at what you'd done and decide what it meant. The debriefer who came off the first helicopter was a man in a suit who identified himself only as a government liaison, and his first question, after establishing who was alive and who was not, was directed at Marsh. "The creatures, how many are still in the tunnels?" "Estimate 4 to 6, Marsh said. "We'll need to go back in." "Yes," Marsh said. "You will." The government liaison looked at Dex and Priest and said, with the careful neutrality of a bureaucrat who had read their files, "These individuals are death row transfer detainees." "These individuals," Mara said, "kept 6 people alive tonight and stopped your bombing run from killing a special operations captain." The government liaison looked at her. "They figured out the generator," she said. "They secured the transmitter. One of them took a creature apart with his bare hands so the signal could go through." She held the man's gaze. "I'm a surgeon. I know the difference between something that should have survived and something that did anyway. This survived because of them." Long silence. Marsh said from beside her, "Whatever determinations are made later are above my pay grade. Right now, these individuals require medical attention and transport. We'll sort the rest on the ground." The government liaison looked at Marsh. Marsh looked back at him with the same flat, particular attention he applied to everything. "Of course, Captain," the liaison said and stepped aside. They flew out low over the desert, the town of Decker's Hollow shrinking below them, dark and still, the mine shafts somewhere beneath it patient and quiet. Mara sat in the jump seat with her shoulder against Dex's good arm, both of them watching the desert slide away beneath them in the darkness. "What happens now?" Dex said, not to her specifically. "To the air, don't know," she said. "Think they'll go back in to the mine." "Yes," he nodded, was quiet for a moment. Then, "Think those things will be ready for that." Mara thought about the creature that had retreated from the loading dock, the one that had gone over the railing and into the scrub and not come back. Not because it was incapacitated, because it had changed its approach. "Yes," she said. "I think they will." Dex looked at his hands in the dim cabin light. "Then I hope they send somebody good." Marsh, across the cabin with his shoulder rebandaged and his eyes closed, said without opening them, "They will." Mara looked at the stars through the helicopter's small window. The same stars Dex had been cataloging in the parking lot. The vast, indifferent scatter of them, and somewhere out there the origin point of whatever had crashed in that mine. Whatever had been locked in cells in the dark for however long, had broken free and come 40 trillion miles to end up in an Arizona copper mine, chasing 6 people who refused, collectively and stubbornly, and for no particularly logical reason, to give up. She thought about what it meant. She'd been thinking about it for hours, and she would keep thinking about it, she suspected, for the rest of her life. The creatures were intelligent, coordinated, geometrically sophisticated. They hunted efficiently and communicated in the dark, and had already calculated the layout of the mine before anyone knew they were moving. And they had lost. Not because they were outgunned, not because they were surprised, but because they had miscounted something, had not factored into their calculations the specific human talent for surviving situations that should not be survivable. The surgeon who reasons about aerosol delivery systems from first principles in a loading dock. The geographer who can hold a map in his memory like a photograph. The broken soldier who knows where bodies fail. The guard who finds the radio in her pocket that she'd forgotten was there. The captain who speaks a code into the dark and trusts that someone on the other end is still listening. They had run the numbers on what humanity could do. They had not run the numbers on what humanity would do when the alternative was nothing. The helicopter banked south, and the desert fell away behind them, enormous and ancient and full of things still waiting to be found. And Mara Voss leaned her head back against the fuselage and felt the vibration of the rotors through the metal and thought, "We are so strange. We are so incredibly, irreducibly strange." And she closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years she slept without dreaming.